Hello and welcome to the business interview. I'm Markus Karlsson. It was a long and winding road for Russia to join the World Trade Organization. 19 years after the country first sought membership, the world's ninth biggest economy has now formally become the 156th member. The World Bank says it will eventually add more than $160 billion to Russia's output each year. But will it be enough to clean up Russia's image as an investment destination and change the perception that business in Russia is weighed down by corruption and red tape? Yaroslav Lisavolek joins me now from Moscow to discuss those issues. He's chief economist at Deutsche Bank Russia. Yaroslav, thanks very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you.
Now, first of all, do you agree with the World Bank's forecast? Will Russia benefit as much from joining the World Trade Organization?
I think those estimates are possible for Russia to achieve. But my sense is that a lot depends on the actual policies that Russia will pursue after WTO accession. And not just Russia itself in terms of macroeconomic policies, in terms of Russia being guided by the norms of the organization. What is also important is that Russia's companies, Russia's corporates, improve their corporate governance. And if this is conducive to greater inflows of capital from abroad, then yes, that should enable Russia to reap the full benefits of WTO accession.
We're going to come back to some of the points you just made there in just a moment. But first, I need to ask you why it took such a long time for Russia to join the WTO. It first applied back in June 1993, and the 19 years of negotiations were the longest ever for a WTO applicant. Why did it take so long?
You know, I really think it was partly due to the rules of the organization itself. As you know, the World Trade Organization operates in accordance with principles whereby all countries have to be on board on critical issues, including on new entrants. And accordingly, Russia had to essentially agree with a vast majority of the countries of the WTO on issues pertaining to its trade regime. So it took quite a lot of time. And I think that kind of mechanism of accepting new members has certainly proven to be quite difficult for countries such as Russia and such as China as well. For large economies that tend to give a lot in terms of trade concessions as large economies to WTO members. So I think that was probably one of the key reasons, apart from, of course, vacillation that at times we saw with regard to Russia's determination to join the organization itself.
Now, let's go back to the point you made then about corporate governance. Now, analysts who we've spoken to say that this adds a much-needed framework of rules in Russia. They basically say that Russian business so far has been a little bit like the Wild West. It seems as if you agree with that assessment, that this could add a much-needed rules framework.
Yes, I think this is probably, arguably, the most important benefit that Russia stands to get from WTO accession. In essence, what I think is going to happen is that Russia will import to some degree these international legal norms, and these international legal norms will become more important in terms of how business is done in Russia. Once Russia is within this club, once it operates according to the rules of the club, yes, its economic policy is more guided by rules, less by discretion, less by ad hoc policies that we've seen in the past.
What about the corruption point? Because that is something that Russia still seems to be suffering from. In Transparency International's most recent corruption perceptions index, Russia came in at 143 out of 182 countries in the world. Do you think that the WTO membership could improve that image?
I think we shouldn't look at WTO accession as a magic wand, as an antidote to all problems in Russia. And certainly there is going to be a positive effect, I think, coming from WTO accession, but I think it will be gradual. It will be incremental in terms of how the legal regime, how corporate governance improves, and how corruption is addressed. I think obviously competitive pressures are very important here, because the greater the competitive pressure, both in terms of countrywide policies, but also in terms of company-specific issues, sector-specific issues, then it's incumbent upon companies to operate in a more transparent way. And transparency, I think, in tandem with this competition, is really the key to dealing away with some of these ills related to corruption, red tape, etc.
So this is the beginning of a process, not the end of it, if you will.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the hard work for Russia, as surprising as it may seem, only starts with WTO accession. By acceding to the WTO, Russia gets the opportunity to start competing in earnest and to start developing its new toolkits in terms of trade policy. I think what is going to be important as well at the macro level of the country is a new trade policy of concluding free trade agreements across the globe. This is something that is going to be possible only now after WTO accession.
Now, the EU's Trade Commissioner, Karel de Gucht, he has said that Russia's membership will offer plenty of business opportunities for both Russian and European companies. Will it indeed go both ways? Will it make it easier for foreigners to do business in Russia as of now on?
Yes, I think it's certainly going to be more predictable, and foreign companies will have tools which they could use to address some of the problems that they encounter in Russia. For example, if there are specific restrictions that Russia has vis-a-vis a certain sector that harms the trade opportunities of WTO countries, these countries can now address their concerns to the dispute settlement body of the WTO. And this is something that Russia will have to abide by. And it works the other way as well. Russia faces a lot of restrictions abroad. There are nearly 100 restrictions abroad targeting Russia's exports. And Russia is certainly intent on using the legal framework, the mechanisms of the WTO, such as the dispute settlement body, to address some of those restrictions as well, and to facilitate exports, especially non-oil exports abroad.
As we've been saying, import tariffs on goods going into Russia will be lowered as the country joins the WTO. Tariffs on foreign-made cars, for instance, will be halved by 2019. Do you think that Russian businesses and manufacturers are ready for this added competition?
If we wait for another 18, 19 years, there's no guarantee that they will be more ready. I think it's better to accede more quickly, to have those competitive pressures, to prod Russian producers into restructuring, into improving their productivity, etc. But certainly this is a concern that some of the sectors, such as textiles, such as food industry, such as the auto industry to some degree as well, they may be running the risk of fiercer competition from imports that in some segments may be hard to sustain. But ultimately, this is, I think, what Russia needs. Without that kind of competitive pressure, I don't think Russia will be capable to come ahead with these greater productivity improvements that Russia so greatly needs now.
You mentioned a few sectors there that could suffer because of the WTO membership. Are there any particular sectors in Russia that could benefit from the WTO membership? Some sectors that we should be keeping an eye on?
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the sectors that stands to benefit the most is the consumer sector. And actually, according to the studies performed by the World Bank and other organizations, it is consumption, the rise in consumption, and the Russian consumer that are seen as the main beneficiaries of trade liberalization, of lower prices, of greater competition. And accordingly, it is probably the consumer sector, Russian retail consumer sector, that stands to benefit. Otherwise, it's also Russian exporters, such as exporters of steel, exporters of chemicals. These will be able to counter some of the protectionism abroad and to widen the geography of their exports abroad, which is quite important in terms of boosting Russia's non-oil exports.
Now, we don't have a lot of time left, but I wanted to ask you about China, because there's been lots of comparisons between China and Russia, because when China joined the WTO in 2001, we saw explosive growth in that country.
Yeah.
Do you think we're going to see similar explosive growth in Russia from now on?
China acceded to the WTO when the global economy was in a somewhat better state, arguably, than it is today. And with Russia acceding this year in the midst of a full-blown financial crisis in the world economy, I think it is probably a tall order to expect a similar magnitude of capital inflows being directed into Russia upon WTO accession. But still, I think that doesn't mean that Russia should not try hard to take advantage of WTO accession. It should not certainly blame the world's financial crisis and should actively pursue the opportunities that are brought about by WTO accession.
All right, Yaroslav, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time. That was Yaroslav Lisavolik from Deutsche Bank Russia. Stay with us here at France 24. We have plenty more news coming your way.